Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 434, Shavuot 2024. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
I'm Lex Rofberg.
I'm Miriam Turlinchamp.
And if you hear Miriam Turlinchamp's voice on this podcast, then 9 times out of 10, that means that we're going to be talking about some Jewish ritual in a deep way, and hopefully you're going to get some new ideas. It's really exciting to have a new voice on the podcast, and of course, it's the voice of our new fearless leader, Miriam. So, Miriam, we're so excited to have you on this podcast. We're going to be talking about Shavuot today. But before we get started talking about Shavuot, Miriam, you have a really exciting announcement. I'm super excited about this announcement. So can you share with the world what this announcement is?
This week we became a family in that we became a family of podcasts. We launched Tales of the Unbound, which is TALES, and you can subscribe to it anywhere that you listen to your podcasts. And it's about you. It's about the listeners. It's about two guys, Ari and Josh, who heard us on the podcast and began a journey towards conversion while incarcerated in a Washington State prison. It's a powerful story of becoming and change, and also about the interaction we have with you, our listeners, and the world that we're trying to make together. So please listen and subscribe to it.
Yeah, so just go to your favorite podcast app and subscribe to Tales of the Unbound. It's TALES. It's not like wagging your tail. It's stories. Tales of the Unbound. So I'm super excited about this. And actually, just to be clear, that this 7-episode series is the first. But hopefully in the months and years to come, there's going to be more series.
Your emails matter. Your emails matter. Yeah. And we're listening to, and we want to tell your story too.
And the specific example of what this is about in terms of the people who listen to Judaism Unbound and converted, I think that relates to the holiday of Shavuot in a couple of ways. I want to float some ideas here. Number one is that I want to let people know that our annual Shavuot Live event is happening. By the way, it is happening tomorrow night, starting at 5 o'clock Eastern time, Saturday.
Tomorrow, if you're listening to this, the day it comes out on Friday, June 7th, the event is June 8th to June 9th, starting at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific.
Yeah, and I think this has happened before, Lex, where we have done Shavuot Live not on the official day of Shavuot according to the rabbinite Jewish calendar. I mean, we can get into a lot of the details here, but people will look at their calendar and they'll say, wait a second, Shavuot doesn't start on Saturday night, so why are we doing our big 24-hour plus Shavuot event starting on Saturday night? We're going to talk about that. And so we'd love you to register for this amazing event, Shavuot Live. All you have to do is go to judaismunbound.com/Shavuot, SHAVUOT, and you can find all the information there about how to register. So go do that now, even if you have to pause the episode for a second to go do that. But the other thing that I want to mention that's going to be going on at Shavuot Live is that there's going to be a ceremony to celebrate the conversion of a number of our Judaism Unbound listeners who are converting to Judaism. That's no accident that that's happening on Shavuot. Shavuot could be imagined, it could be reimagined as the holiday of conversion. And we've talked about that Shavuot has gone through these iterations over the course of Jewish history. You know, initially it was a harvest festival. And then after the temple was destroyed and there was no more agriculture or not as much agriculture in the land of Israel anymore, it started to become this holiday that was marking the time when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. And you can imagine that, well, maybe it'll go through another iteration. And actually the idea that it might become a holiday that celebrates conversion to Judaism would be really connected to elements that are already there, such as the fact that the book of Ruth is the traditional book that we read on Shavuot, and that is, of course, the story of a non-Jewish woman, a Moabite woman, Ruth, who throws her lot in with the Jews. Whether that's exactly what we call conversion today or not or whatever is a whole set of conversations that we could have.
And have had. We'll put them in the show notes.
And have had. But Mike, it's striking me that maybe there's a small element here that we're going to be doing at Jewish Live tomorrow that is a taste of what's to come in terms of how Shavuot might morph again. So I wanted to throw some of that out as a place to start our conversation about Shavuot Live and about Shavuot this year in general.
Yeah, I super appreciate that. And a little bit about Shavuot Live. So you gave us a great backstory of Shavuot, that it's this holiday that has been around for thousands of years. Not all of our holidays have traced all the way back to the Torah, of course. I mean, I think folks know that in the back of their mind, but we don't think about that always. We don't think about how so many of our holidays were actually inventions long after the Bible. But Shavuot is not one of those. It's there in the text of the Torah. But arguably, the Shavuot that we experience today, I mean, not even really arguably, definitely, the Shavuot observances that people mark today across whatever movements, even very traditionalist folks, are not found anywhere in the Torah. Shavuot has totally transformed. You could say it's transformed multiple times, like it's had version 1.0, version 2.0, version 3.0, version 4.0. You could also say that it's had like 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. It's had like evolutions constantly, and it's been unfolding for a long time. In any respect, Shavuot Live, in our view, is one of the exciting new manifestations of a Shavuot observance, which is a Zoom event that lasts 24 hours, where we spend that time relating to Torah, learning from incredible people in the Judaism Unboundiverse who bring their wisdom, and not just wisdom. Sometimes they bring their music, sometimes they bring their activities. It's very participatory. Last year, we had a couple hundred pages of Zoom chat that were like size 10-point font. Like we had tens of thousands of words of Zoom chat. And all of that is the point. Like from our perspective, there was this cool creation with Shavuot about 500 years ago, so recent in Jewish history, of the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, this idea that you would stay up all night relating to Torah, learning text. And I say Torah really in the broadest sense, because even in those traditional spheres, if you go to like an Orthodox space that's doing an all-night study session, it's not as if they're starting with Genesis and going through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Like the notion of what quote unquote counts as Shavuot learning is really vast. You can dive into biblical text. You can dive into rabbinic text from much later. You can dive into Jewish law. You can dive into Jewish stories. Like it's actually a very expansive notion of Torah. And we looked at that ritual and we said, wow, there's this idea that we love Torah so much. We love learning so much. For us, we also love unlearning so much. That's a part of Torah, that we stay up all night doing it. But what if it wasn't just all night? What if we made this 24 hours? We live in a world where you can actually do that. You can bring people to a Zoom room and press start and have it run for an entire day. And we launched that in 2020. Over our first 4 years, there's been over 3,000 people cumulatively who have come and participated. We've had really incredible conversations. And for a lot of us, it's become a highlight of our entire Jewish year. And obviously, I'm biased in that I host it. But genuinely, even like most of the time, most of the 24 hours, I am a Jew in the pew. I am receiving wisdom from the teachers that are invited. And it is truly an unbelievable time to be in such a geographically diverse group with people from, multiple continents. It's spectacular. That's a little window into Shavuot Live. And what I'll say is historically, we've had a lot of, I'm going to say, converts in progress and we've had people at every stage of the journey from not being Jewish to Jewish who are overrepresented in Shavuot Live and in all of our programming. And so there's the textual connection you brought in, Dan, of the Book of Ruth. But I'd also say that some of Jewish ritual is just, to quote the Talmud, going out into the marketplace and seeing who's there, seeing what they're doing. We've gone into the marketplace of Shavuot Live and seen, there's like a huge population of folks here who recently converted to Judaism or are in the process of converting. So maybe we don't say that they're sort of incidentally in this space. Maybe we say that specifically that's part of what this ritual is for.
I think what's powerful about Shavuot is that we're all receiving in that moment. We're sort of honoring the way that wisdom has come into our life. And I think we call it Torah. And there's plenty of other ways we could be calling it that. But what does it mean to say once a year, I'm going to reaffirm or affirm for the first time the wisdom that's guiding me in the world. And then what is the ritual that's around that? In this case, I think through Judaism Unbound, it's trying to learn from as many people and scholars as possible and our fellow listeners. And then I think it's also about finding a way to mark that moment of change or growth or wisdom making in the moment of saying, actually, today I see the Torah being given to me in this way, and next year I'll see it in another way. But this year for me, in the wake of so much hardship around Jewish identity, so much pain and change that's happened, I'm really curious about what Shavuot's going to be, what Shavuot will evoke for so many of us as individuals and also as a collective, and to come together and carefully, gently, and beautifully look at what wisdom has to say about this moment, both personally and communally, is going to be fascinating. So it makes sense to me that in the penultimate hour, we will be honoring the first 5 of our Judaism Unbounders who will be affirming their Jewish life and who have done a Beit Din and a mikveh in all different places in different ways. And it's just an opportunity to study with them, celebrate them, send a little love their way, and remind ourselves that we're always choosing who we're surrounding ourselves with and who we want to create circles of belonging with. And in this case, Judaism Unbound offers a unique place to be doing that. We're not just listening to ideas. These ideas are shaping us. In this ritual, we'll be practicing together how we can reimagine Shavuot, how we can reimagine what wisdom has to say and what belonging looks like in this day and age.
Miriam, I'm picking up on what you were saying earlier about we have this annual opportunity to experience Torah in a new way, or to perhaps have Torah revealed to us in a new way. And if that's how we think about Shavuot, again, it really feels like there's a strong connection there to me to conversion. With conversion, a few things. One is that you can say, well, if I'm converting to Judaism, then this is the first time that I'm going to be experiencing Torah or have the Torah revealed to me. And if we sort of integrated deeply the idea of conversion into this holiday, by the way, like, again, I love the idea that we're not inventing this out of whole cloth, that the book of Ruth has been the reading for Shavuot for many, many, many centuries. So this connection was already there, but maybe insufficiently noted, or maybe it was there for a different reason, but now we can really pull out the conversion part. I'm thinking about how, let's say that Shavuot became the Jewish holiday where annually we celebrate conversion to Judaism. It would, of course, also make sense in a world in which people are saying this cliche all the time, which is true, right? That we are all Jews by choice today, meaning that we may have been born Jewish, but the reality is that nobody is forced to be Jewish if they don't want to be, or very few people are. We don't aspire to a world where people are forced to be Jewish. We imagine and dream of a world where people have total freedom to choose the life that they choose to live, and we want them to choose Judaism, whether they were born Jewish or not, if it's the right thing for them. And so in that world, every one of us who was born Jewish would also experience this holiday as sort of a chance to reaffirm our Judaism, to choose to be Jewish for another year. And so I love the idea that we would have Shavuot for everybody would be this experience of conversion. And the last thing I want to float is, like, you were talking about Shavuot Live being kind of cerebral. Part of that is because it's online. I would love for you and for me and for all of us to dream a little bit about what a Shavuot experience might look like in the future that wasn't online. Because I've had this dream for many years of a kind of Burning Man, like a Jewish Burning Man, where we would have an in-person festival once a year. I have to admit that this was not my idea, but somebody else suggested calling it the Burning Bush Festival, which I love, and it definitely connects to Shavuot. So imagine that every year on Shavuot, we had a Burning Bush Festival, that there would be an opportunity for everybody who wanted to jump in a lake, or some body of water and have a kind of mikveh experience, whether they were actually converting to Judaism from somewhere else or they were just born Jewish and they're having this moment of reaffirmation of their Jewish identity. I could just imagine that being not cerebral at all and pretty awesome. So I'm curious where you would take some of this stuff.
I'm so into this big event. Bethel Woods 2025. It's calling my name. I really feel like we should do this.
Bethel, House of
Exactly.
God.
It's got a little Woodstock. It's all those things. I also think, I think if this feels uncomfortable as you're listening to it, like, ooh, what is that sensation? I think it is the evangelical in us that we swim in Christian hegemony, and that's difficult to think about. What does a group conversion look like? What's a group immersion? Forgetting that we do group immersions. That's part of Jewish life. That does happen. I think it's Kashira Halev Fife who gave me the idea of doing a kayaking experience before Rosh Hashanah, and I did it a couple of years ago. It was really hot and sticky and humid and full of ticks, beautiful Ohio summer day. And so everyone wanted to swim after the kayak. And I was like, we shouldn't swim. We should do a mikveh together. And so, we didn't take off all our clothes, but we did immerse together and say prayers together and then come back on the beach and dry off together. And there was this moment of becoming and saying, I am ready for this moment, that I think it didn't take the place of the individual experience that probably had to happen before high holidays also, but it did make something different to do a communal one. And the idea of it being music and art, and yes, some cerebral content too. It's not like it's devoid of that in ritual, but to do something as a team, I think sounds gorgeous and affirming that even as we're coming from different places, we're becoming something together.
Yeah, first off, I love this kayaking notion. And I saw Kashira recently and we were talking about this. And for the high holidays, obviously we're not talking about that now, but I think it's cool that kayak is spelled the same backwards and forwards in English. It gets at that sort of turning the page, like looking back, looking forward notion of teshuvah, of repentance. There's something cool there. But I also want to say, for those who are like thinking last minute, maybe I'll pull together an offline thing. Our Shavuot live event is on the weekend before what is on the calendar as Rabbinic Shavuot. It is tomorrow as we release this. You might be listening to this and it's today for all I know, but it's June 8th to 9th. And I say that because that means that if you want to try something experimental on the day that is on the rabbinic calendar, Shavuot, or the days, June 11th evening through 13th, you also can. And I say that partially because I'm doing that. A bunch of friends here in Providence, Rhode Island, we're reviving a ritual I did before our Shavuot live days, which was that I and a bunch of friends went to an IHOP where you can access dairy food for as long as you want, and it's open 24 hours. And we brought in a whole slew of Jewish texts, and we brought in our phones so that we could access the internet, and we taught each other and learned together Torah from like 7 or 8 p.m. all the way till the sun rose at like 7 a.m. We talked to the IHOP people. We like told them what the situation was. We spent lots of money on.
I just love it's nostalgic and innovative at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. But what we learned is that IHOP gets bumping at 2 a.m. in Providence, Rhode Island, because that's when all the bars close. But IHOP is still open, so you don't have to feel like this is like, oh, if you go to Shavuot Live, that's your Shavuot. You've ticked it off your list and you can't do anything else offline. Pull off the mikveh immersion thing with some friends or solo. Like, I think that's a super good idea. I wanted to dwell a little bit in that calendar question because every year when we have had our Shavuot Live at a time that is not precisely on the holiday of Shavuot, we get emails about it. We get lots of questions. Why is this on a day that isn't Shavuot? What's the deal? There's many answers for that. First off, from many Jewish viewpoints, historically and now, Shavuot on the rabbinic calendar is actually the wrong day. And what I mean by that is there's been vicious debates. We talked about this recently with Dahlia Marks. There's been long debates in Jewish history about when Shavuot should be, because of the biblical holidays, it's the only one that is not given a specific date. The Torah doesn't say it's on this day of this month. It does that for other biblical holidays. What it does instead is it says, okay, there's this thing, Passover. Then there is the Matzah Fest, Chag HaMatzot, Matzah Festival for 7 days. And then it says, from the day after the Sabbath, from the day after Shabbat, Mimacharat HaShabbat, you count off 7 weeks, and then it's Shavuot. That's pretty vague. Does it mean that you start counting those 7 weeks from the day after Shabbat within the holiday of Passover? Does it mean all of Passover happens, then there's a Shabbat, then there's a day after Shabbat, and then you start? There's actually 4 different common understandings in the Second Temple times about when Shavuot should be based on this text. Multiple of them always anchor Shavuot on a weekend, on what is now a weekend at least. Multiple of them say, you're supposed to start counting the 7 weeks on the day after Shabbat. Shabbat is a Saturday. So you start counting on a Sunday, you go 7 weeks, And then the 50th day is Shavuot, which would again be a Sunday. From many perspectives, including Karaites, who we featured on the show before, Shavuot is always on a weekend in today's society. So from our perspective, celebrating Shavuot live on the closest weekend, on the weekend just before the rabbinic Shavuot, it's not only like some wild, off the beaten path, newfangled way of doing this holiday. It is actually a way of tying it to this traditional idea that Shavuot would always be Mimacharat HaShabbat, would always be the day after Shabbat. And indeed, we are marking it this year from the end of Shabbat on a Saturday into the day after Shabbat in a way that will feel really special to me as somebody who counts the Omer that way. Even as I'm aware that it's a minority take in today's world on Jewish tradition. We as an organization are constantly interested in recentering those takes and those people that have been marginalized. And so the calendar date of this event in and of itself is doing that.
And I just like the idea of doing Jewish holidays on weekends. Just like I think that it's more important to do Jewish holidays on days when people will actually do them than on a day that you think is the actual Jewish holiday. I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff that we don't have time to get into. We've talked about these from the Talmud that suggests that the holiday days don't have inherent sanctity of their own. What makes them sacred is when human beings decide to have them. And there's some great stories in the Talmud about that. And I'm overstating it from the Talmud's perspective. Like, I don't think that the rabbis of the Talmud would necessarily like the idea of moving the holidays to American weekends. But I actually think that they would be open to the conversation because, in a sense, a lot of what the Talmud was doing, and we talk about this all the time on the Oral Talmud, is that they were reinterpreting the Torah in ways that were clearly not what the Torah originally meant, but that fit the world that they were trying to build. So I think that the notion that we would do that to their ideas would be one that they would warmly embrace. In and of itself, it's worth thinking about, hey, don't we just want the maximum number of people realistically possible to be able to have this holiday impact them? And the truth is, like, we literally know that having Shavuot Live take place on a weekend vastly increases the number of people that participate. It's just data.
And it's precise data from past years. Like, we did it on a weekday and it got much smaller attendance than when we've done it on weekends.
So I think it's easy to make the argument why it's important to celebrate and be together. And it makes sense that in the day's time, however far back we want to go back, we would need as many hands on deck as possible for harvest, for reaping, for collecting. It makes sense that you would need community. I'm curious sort of what this group thinks about and our listeners think about what's the power of doing this in community now? You know, Dan and I are sort of playing with this idea of group conversions or group affirmations of where we are in this place of, and Lex talking about being in IHOP, all these different ways of saying we need other people to do this affirmation or connect back into Torah. What do you think the value is of that? Like, why do we actually need this? And why isn't it the same thing as taking a long walk on the beach by yourself, which of course has its own validity in this too?
First off, take the long walk on the beach. I want to answer your question. And I also want to shout that there is power in the solo experience too. I mean, I've had versions of both, or even me and my early in our relationship, some of the most important bonding that me and my now wife had was I told her Shavuot was my favorite holiday. I was in an environment where we had no all-night Shavuot thing, online or off. And so we sat with each other and like geeked out over the Mishnah for a while that I was really into at the time. And we spent multiple hours doing that. That was two people. Was that a community? We could have a long conversation about what community is, but like it wasn't a big group. It wasn't a community in the way that gathering in the Torah at Mount Sinai was a community, or even gathering at the temple for pilgrimage festivals was a community. And I think it was really powerful. So experiment with all of those. That's the beautiful thing about making Shavuot a 24-hour observance, or even a 24-hour observance beforehand, and then 1 to 2 days, a few days later on the rabbinic calendar. Like, you've got a lot of opportunities to try the solo version, to try a version with a partner or a friend, and also to be a part of a big group. But the big group side, I will say, like, this moment is now understood to commemorate the receiving of Torah at Mount Sinai, like that particular moment in the narrative of the Jewish people. And that moment, more than any other moment, tradition has seen as inclusive of all people in all times. We were at Mount Sinai, quote unquote. There's this idea that all of us who are living now, even though we weren't alive 3,000 years ago, and even if this is a mythical story, even if it's not like a factual thing that happened, the idea that we were all there, that everybody across Jewish history received this, is so important. We're talking about conversion, right? Like, even when you don't have a genealogical connection to Jewishness, you were at Mount Sinai. That's not like wacky, interesting, radical Judaism Unbound take, kids. That's the classic notion, is that when you are part of the Jewish people, no matter whether you were born Jewish, you became Jewish, a little bit of both, a little murky middle, whatever it is, we were all at Mount Sinai. So being with part of the all is really nice. And that's another argument I'd make for marking it on Zoom, by the way. This is like the most incredible opportunity to bring a big number of people together who would not otherwise be able to gather with other Jews. Like, the internet makes that possible for people in Costa Rica and Spain and Australia. When you're supposed to mark a diverse gathering of all Jews across time and space, it's helpful to have multiple time zones in the room. It's a little model of what we're doing, right? Like, we're in different times in the Zoom. And so, we're also with the people from 1,000 years ago and with the Jews 1,000 years in the future, assuming they exist and climate change doesn't destroy all of us. Like, that's powerful. It's actually, in my view, the logical extension of the holiday that we would have as big and as diverse a group of people in a room as we can. And so if we can include geographic diversity in that equation, let's do it. Like, I'm excited about my IHOP thing in Providence, but it will all be people in Providence. All the more exciting that we would bring together people from all around the world.
I really like this time zone thing, Lex. I think you should keep playing it out, because when you think about the regular, rabbinite Shavuot that's going to happen a little bit later, you think about like the time zones go even more, right? Because then our Shavuot Live can be seen as just an even earlier time zone than the people that are having Shavuot on the official day of Shavuot. And when you start thinking that way, then I think it goes to where you're saying, like, then eventually you go all the way down to the people, the ancient Israelites, and they're just kind of in a different time zone. I think it's a very interesting take on how to imagine this cross-time experience that I really want to dig in further. The other thing, though, that before we sort of drift too far off it, to your question, Miriam, I was thinking about why do it in a group. And I was thinking about something that I don't think we've thought about before in this context, which is the power of witnessing. I've been thinking about it in relation to weddings. I mean, I taught a class in the Yeshiva about officiating Jewish weddings. And one of the topics that came up in really interesting ways was, what is the role of the people who are there that are not getting married in the wedding? Are they there just to kind of be there and be nice and be friends? Or is there some way in which they're actually involved in the ceremony, and their being there is essential to the ceremony, and we should give them even a greater role? One person in the class talked about how in the, I believe, Mennonite tradition, there is a tradition that everybody who's attending the wedding signs the document that would be, our version of the ketubah. So that the idea that everybody who's there has to sign the ketubah, right? That there's some way that what's happening is not just happening to the couple that's getting married, it's happening to the community. The community has changed. The families are obviously changed by what is happening to these two people. And I want to bring that back to Shavuot and say, if we're going to imagine Shavuot as this holiday that is going to be redefined as the one where all Jews annually essentially affirm their Judaism for another year, that ought to be done with witnesses, right? That there's because it's not just about you. It is about you, but it's also about those with whom you're in community. And in a sense, we're all affirming that one another is part of this community. And by the way, that's one of the places where I think we're not just doing conversions through Judaism Unbound because we think it's cool. I mean, honestly, that is one of the reasons. But there are other reasons, which are that other communities have made it hard to convert to Judaism in ways that we don't think it should be. This community, which I didn't think 8 years ago when we started Judaism Unbound, I didn't really think we were creating a community. That wasn't what I had in mind. That wasn't my goal. But it has become a community in lots of ways, and actually multiple communities. But I feel like we're starting to see like this community wants to warmly embrace people who other Jewish communities might not. And so all of us being welcomed each year back into the community is just as powerful as the idea that each year I am going to decide personally that I want to be part of this thing, Judaism, and or this community, whether the Jewish community writ large or the Judaism Unbound community. So I think there's something really powerful that we could dig into on the possibility that a communal Shavuot in particular is a really powerful and essential thing.
It's a beautiful bookend, I think, to the introspective and personal work of the high holidays, to have another side of a communal version of that. I mean, as somebody who's planning a wedding in this stage in life, we thought a lot about, eloping to Jamaica.
Mazel tov!
Thanks. And, just making it about us. And, someone who's facilitated many weddings, I thought a lot about it. And in the end, we decided that it was about the village, as cliche as it is. And so what does it mean? So our whole ceremony is all wrapped around the village and the witness. And I think of them not just as passive voyeurs to the experience of love, or in this case, the experience of becoming this next stage of Jew or whatever sort of covenant we're accepting, but also as an accountability partner. When things get tough, not if, but when, either in our faith tradition, our religious practice, our families, our marriages, we need the people who were there to say, hey, I saw you that day. And I remember what you said. And I remember how you felt. And I remember all the different elements. And I'm going to remind you of who you are in this practice. And I think then what becomes important is what we say. What's the vow? And I think it's easier in a wedding to know what the vow is. But I'm wondering, again, teaching this introduction class with you has been so wonderful. And one of the elements that you taught recently that I will hopefully not share terribly, but one of the things you've taught that's been really resonant for me is rituals mapping against a lifetime or lifespan that is no longer accurate, that we have life cycles for a 30-year-old lifespan, which was true in the ancient world. But now with the average lifespan being 70 years, 75 years, hopefully longer than that, that there's going to be different iterations, different life cycles that might be appropriate for us, which, some of us, if we're lucky, just get to have a long trajectory of multiple different kinds of life cycles. And for others, we might have multiple marriages or multiple ways of being in this world, multiple sort of stages. And I think that is really true in our religion, that it's not static. And there are years where we don't believe in God. And there are years that we're not nationalists. There are years that we're fiercely one way or another. And to say to the people around us, to our witnesses, hold me accountable for this year that I vowed to be X in the world, and that my Judaism serves me in this way. And actually, this is my source text. This is my mantra for the year, not for forever. And maybe every year it's the same one. But I think whether you're walking on the beach or I'm in an online experience or I'm in a synagogue, to say, what is the vow of this year? And who am I going to share that out with? And you know what? It can just be an email to us, guys. Like whatever sort of works for you, but hold one another accountable for the beauty you're going to do in the world.
Miriam, if only the name of this holiday, Shavuot, meant directly the word for oaths, which is a synonym for vows, then we would really be able to run with what you're saying. Oh, wait, it does. The word Shavuot means oaths.
O-A-T-H. O-A-T-H.
Yeah, O-A-T-H.
So
like
people here.
Oath, as, commitment. And Shavuot, the same letters, exact same spelling. It's one of the categories of Jewish vows or oaths. It's one of the categories that's mentioned in Kol Nidre, the famous moment on Yom Kippur, where vows are actually nullified, which is not my favorite thing. But like the notion that you would make a big commitment on Shavuot, it makes a lot of sense. And there's linguistic debates, by the way, about whether the two meanings of Shavuot, of oaths on the one hand, and weeks, because that's what it is usually translated as, festival of weeks, because you count all these weeks. Sheva of Shavuot is a 7, and so it means like a week in the 7-day period sense or 7-year period sense. The Book of Jubilees, which I'm so obsessed with, seems to have thought that the meaning of Shavuot as weeks and as oaths were both part of the holiday. It wasn't like making some sort of creative move. It seems to have thought that this holiday was actually about oaths. It was about commitments.
What oaths was it about?
Throughout Genesis, whenever there are vows or oaths made, so there's a few of them. Jacob makes like a vow to God. There's a few moments where patriarchs make commitments, and there's also a bunch of moments with covenants. What's a covenant? We think of covenant. The covenant of Sinai is sort of what this holiday rests on. There's a bunch of other covenants, Brit, in Genesis, and not even just in Genesis, and multiple of those. The Book of Jubilees says that they happen in the middle of the third month, which is to say on Shavuot. They do this multiple times. So Jubilees, some scholars argue, is the origin, is the first place that the notion of Torah revelation as a commitment between two parties, God and the Jewish people, on Shavuot. Jubilees is the first text that starts to sort of unroll that idea, because it's not an idea that's present in the Torah. But anyway, like I bring that up because I think Miriam's idea is so good. And again, we shouldn't need to give ancient precedent for a good idea. It could just be a good idea. But since we can say Shavuot's meaning is actually tied to making oaths or vows or commitments, let's run with that.
I'd love this. Like just to translate it as the Festival of Vows instead of the Festival of Weeks, and just like run with that. I love it.
Yeah, and we can, and it can be both. That, like, to me, I genuinely think that the word seven, which is the undergirding, like Shavuot, that's plural, it's like sevens, Festival of Sevens in a sense. I think that seven as a completion word in Hebrew is associated with a kind of oath making. Like you're making a complete commitment. I can't prove this, and there are linguistic people who like what I'm saying and those who push back on it. And Sheva Brachot, 7 blessings at a wedding, when I lead weddings, I mention all the time that there's a reason this 7 is here. It's a creation hyperlink. So when the world is created, it's in 7 days. And so we're creating a new world that is that couple's life together. And so you need a 7 to create that new world. That's the formula in Jewish science. But also, it's a form of vow making. It's a form of oath making to bring in a 7. That you're in the idea of like vows that people write to each other today at a wedding. The last thing I want to say on weddings, because I loved where both of you went with that, is I actively say to the kahal, to the community, not the audience, I actively say to them that they are witnesses whenever I facilitate. And it's usually just before the 7 blessings. And I invite them to really take seriously the act of saying Amen after each blessing. A lot of people don't know the words. A lot of people aren't Jewish, but they can say Amen. It changes the ritual from being like 2 parallel lines, with the lines being the stage, quote unquote, the chuppah versus the community, versus being a 3-dimensional plane. Like we're all on a shared plane that is the ground we're all standing on, not 2 separate things with one looking at the other. And it's actually something we bring to Shavuot Live, because being part of the chat, being part of the kahal in that way is just as much of the event as being the presenter in the room. And people come in and out, and they're 1 second the presenter, and then they're in the chat. Like I love the vibe of this event.
I just want to note that I think it could be interesting if Shavuot became a day that Jews had weddings on. Just to throw that in. Just running with this idea that it's the Festival of Vows, the festival where we vow to be Jewish for another year, where it's the festival, like Miriam, like you were talking about, that we vow what kind of person do we want to be, or how do we want to be in the world, or that we vow commitments to partners like a wedding or other ways. And I mean, I just think that there's like something really, like in a way, what I'm getting at is that what I feel like we're teasing out in this conversation, and I hope it comes through, is like, what does the process look like where you sort of update and upgrade a holiday to be something that we really need it to be, or that fits our way of living in a powerful way, but that actually maintains its connectivity to what it always has been. And it's actually not all that hard to make it that. So the only other thing that I just want to mention is that it makes me think about all the holidays, as working together. And Miriam, I loved what you were saying about bookending it to the high holidays, where maybe the high holidays are more about individual vow making, which, by the way, wasn't always the way that it was. I mean, the high holidays used to be about collective vow making or collective things. We've talked about that before. So when the high holidays evolved into this individual introspection kind of thing, but didn't start out that way. And maybe in doing that, we lost something that we needed, which was that sort of collective witnessing or vow making or all that. And maybe that kind of moves over to Shavuot. And it makes me wonder in this whole conversation, like, well, what is Passover in that story? What is Hanukkah in that story? Thinking about the holidays more broadly as these opportunities to kind of reboot our priorities, not once a year. You know, that's part of the way where I feel like New Year's resolutions don't work so well because we can't sustain it for a whole year. So the idea of having these periodic Jewish opportunities to reboot something, even if they're kind of the same, not that different one from the other, I feel like human beings probably need something every 2 or 3 months to really be able to live in the world the way that we dream that we would.
Isn't it one habit every 40 days? I think that's what it is. I think that's sort of how the holiday goes. I guess in this case, it's 50 days. So we're sort of working through it. Adam Grant talks about how you can't have multiple resolutions. You have to choose sort of one and then sort of follow that through. And I kind of like that religiously too, or any change you're trying to make. You just like kind of pick one thing that you're just going to go hard into for a little while. And then every 40 days-ish, you come back at it and you say, okay, where am I?
Yeah. I love this idea of like we need multiple moments in the year to really have the goal of a holiday work. It can't just be once a year. And I'm feeling called back to the conversion piece because I really want to have at least one moment on the Jewish calendar year that is marked not only as like talking about conversion, which we do with the book of Ruth on Shavuot. That's already like a thing that happens at a lot of Shavuot, but really having what we're doing this year, which is like people actually completing that conversion process on that day. I think that's awesome. We could have it be a Shavuot thing. We could also have it be a Hanukkah thing. The book of Judith, which people have tied to Hanukkah, contains the most, like when we talk about Ruth, we have to sort of be careful because she doesn't quite say she converts. She doesn't become not Moabite anymore. The book still calls her Moabite afterwards. And I've talked about why that's actually meaningful for me as somebody in an interfaith relationship, looking at that book not just as a conversion paradigm, but as potentially an interfaith paradigm where she's still Moabite, but also deeply connected to Jewishness. I think we can do both. I don't think we have to pick one of those. The book of Judith contains a character, Achior, who like pretty by the book converts, including, because he is male, a circumcision. Like he is not Israelite, and by the end of the book, he squarely is. But part of the issue is Judith was not canonized. And so we don't have it so far in our accepted canon of what counts as biblical text. But it has kind of been canonized in the sense that like people talk about it on Hanukkah. It's a known story. And so I think it'd be cool if, and Hanukkah and Shavuot, they're spaced kind of perfectly. If we want to have 2 moments in the year that check in about conversion, because you're alluding to having high holidays that are related to vows in one way and having Shavuot, which is related to vows, oaths in this collective way. So we could have Shavuot and then Hanukkah, each of which have a story that we can draw on related to conversion. And both of them are good excuses. I mean, I don't mean excuses in a bad way, but they're like good moments to anchor people's conversion processes, either starting or being completed or whatever it might be.
In the Reformed denomination, we do have a way of confirming our Jewishness around Shavuot, and we invite our high school graduates to dress in white, all this energy of saying, I'm still, after my bat mitzvah or b'nai mitzvah, or maybe I didn't even have one, I declare that I'm Jewish, and I'm doing that in this very performative, wedding-like way. I mean, the first time I saw it happen was not the way I grew up. The first time I saw it happen, it was powerful. These children are dressed in white and they have these flowers all around the Torah. And it felt so reminiscent of so many other cultures at the same time. And you could just feel not the appropriation, but maybe the synergy between so many cultures. And it felt almost modern and archaic at the same time. If we're doing offerings of some kind, and they weren't animal offerings, but these flower offerings happening in sort of a standard building. And it felt... It's so interesting, I think, that we do this.
Yeah, I think that's really important to shout out. And we're going to put in the show notes a link to Laura Yaris's presentation in Shavuot Live a few years ago, which really dives into the history of Shavuot in the United States in particular. And I'll put Catherine Horowitz's follow-up this past year, also a Shavuot live session. Basically, Shavuot was a massive holiday in the United States from the late 1800s through the early 1900s. Dress up in fancy clothes, get a bunch of beautiful, lovely smelling flowers. That is to tie it to some of the agricultural pieces historically. And then prance out your high school graduates that you're so proud of. And in the earliest versions of this ritual in the 1800s and 1900s, they would actually confirm, like they would literally say, like, I confirm verbally some kind of affirmation. And maybe some congregations still do it in this way. I think most of the time it's just like the group leads a service or leads a something. And we want all of us to be actively confirming, affirming our Jewishness, not just sort of, yeah, I am that. Does it matter to me? Does it not? It just sort of floats around. But having an annual moment to really mark, yeah, I'm on board with this. I'm invested in this moving forward feels powerful. But we can also generate our own versions of affirming that require fewer white robes, maybe which we can do in or out of synagogues that are tied to this holiday. But that's kind of the closing note that I think we'll end on today, which is appropriate because we want to really celebrate tomorrow and maybe today, if you're listening to this on Saturday, June 8th or Sunday, June 9th. We really want to celebrate both our love for Jewish tradition and our inheritance as Jews and our creative new rituals. So both of those end up making their way into Shavuot Live. We have a lot of learning. We have a lot of unlearning. We have a lot of ancient text. We have a lot of contemporary text. We love building all of those into this ritual. And I hope you will head to judaismunbound.com/Shavuot, again, SHAVUOT. Register for this. Tell your friends. Bring them. You can come for 30 minutes. You can come for 3 hours. You can come for 24 straight hours. Heck, we've had people tell us that they come at the beginning. They have to take a schluff. They have to nap for like 4 or 5 hours in the middle, but they stay in the Zoom room. They've actually told us they go on video off so that we don't hear their snoring or anything. But we've had people tell us that they did this and like they loved waking up to the sound of more Torah. So do that if you want to. JudaismUnbound.com/Shavuot. It's like our biggest gathering numerically of the year. You're going to get to witness in the ways we talked about the conversions of some amazing people. And every step of the way, I think, is going to be a super powerful experience on an individual level and on a broader kind of community level. So we hope that you'll come. As always, if you have questions, whether they're practical questions about Shavuot Live or whatever, or if you have bigger ideas about Shavuot, you should be in touch with us. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of our handles are at Judaism Unbound. We've got our email addresses, dan@judaismunbound.com, miriam@judaismunbound.com, and lex@judaismunbound.com. Important closing reminder that Tales of the Unbound, our wonderful new podcast, is here. And so if you're listening to this on Friday and you're like, I can't wait, it's too long to wait one more day for Shavuot, I want some Torah now, go to somewhere. I mean, you're already in a podcast app listening to us, so just click whatever tab and go to Tales of the Unbound. Hopefully it's under Related, under our page. That'd be cool. We can't make that happen automatically, but click Tales of the Unbound, listen, and that'll be either your warm-up or part of your Shavuot experience. So all of that is what we hope will happen in the next few days. We can't wait to share this holiday with you. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.